This is the Darshan Talks podcast. Before this week's podcast, why does it cost so much to bring a drug to market? Darshan will introduce this episode with a recap for the week of Thursday, June 18th, 2020.
So this week has been kind of interesting. We've seen several new bits and pieces of information. Everything still seems to focus on COVID. So the news we're looking at does have a COVID bend to it. There was a recent Lancet study that came out and talked about potential regulatory treatments, and it talks about the multiple angles that are available to companies that are trying to, multiple regulatory pathways, if you will, available to companies that are trying to bring a product to market. The key thing I would caution is that, number one, there was no indication that that's exhaustive. There are other ways that I've seen that might be applicable. And that's not to say that you couldn't actually, it's not the regulations that are going to be preventing this. It's the actual risk benefit that that must be known. Unfortunately, while we're willing to make certain concessions for risk and benefit, considering the significant impact on the regular life of individuals, there is something to be said for actually knowing that the product works as intended and that the safety profile is acceptable. So while we might look at things like breakthrough therapy to evaluate the process, one will have to keep coming back. There is some evidence that real-world evidence might be useful, and that is something that the FDA commissioner has said that they will be considering as they continue on a more long-term basis. So stay tuned for that piece of it. There was also some news that pharma is consistently overlooking Spanish TV, and these Hispanic audiences are not feeling connected. Again, if you as a company are trying to connect with patients, trying to understand them, you need to understand them in the way that they want to be understood, which may mean speaking to them in Spanish and paying attention to more regional dialects, whether it's Spanish, whether it's Portuguese, whether it's another language, whether it's Hindi, whether it's Mandarin or something else. Another bit of news that's coming out is that, as we predicted in general, there's likely to be a new normal after COVID. So everyone keeps talking about telemedicine. Telemedicine is probably going to take root. Obviously, in the U.S., there are some regulations out there already. Globally, those regulations are patchy at best. The one key thing you probably should start thinking about is, if you're moving into a world where digital health is new normal, who owns the data that you get? Is your product, if you're coming up with a software product, is it subject to HIPAA or CCPA or GDPR or the myriad of other laws that may come in? Another really interesting piece of news, if you follow the cosmetics world, is L'Oreal Paris actually came back to Monroe Bergdorf and offered her a new role. For those of you who may remember, she is a transgender model who was sacked in 2017, and in the new more woke 2020 world, L'Oreal admits that it did her wrong. It regretted the handling of that sacking inappropriately and has asked her to join the new UK Diversity and Inclusion Advisory Board. Another really interesting bit of news around cosmetics is that NARS is now experimenting with audio marketing. That's really interesting because Google and Amazon have talked about the future of search being in audio, whether they're talking about the audio's Alexa, or they're talking about more of the Google, I forget right now what it's called, or Siri. Any of those will tell you that audio is the future. There have been other discussions. There was I can't remember if it was a congressional report, a congressional hearing, or a report, but Google was talking about being more worried about audio than they were about websites, if you will. So to see NARS basically saying they're going to look more at audio marketing is interesting. This week was also interesting because the Trump administration has decided to revoke healthcare protections for certain transgender patients. And it's kind of interesting. I believe this is LGBTQ month, So the timing is interesting for sure. Another bit of news that came out is that the U.S. states, that several U.S. states have accused 26 drug makers of generic drug price fixing. So it seems that's going to become more complicated. Some big pharma has gotten involved because they have generic drug subsidiaries, but that's definitely problematic as well. So stay tuned. If you think I missed an important news story, feel free to reach out to me at Darshan Talks on Twitter. I look forward to hearing from you.
This is the Darshan Talks podcast, regulatory guy, irregular podcast with host Darshan Kulkarni. You can find the show on Twitter at Darshan Talks or the show's website at darshantalks.com.
One of the biggest questions that gets raised very often is, why do drugs cost so much? So we're going to do a little bit of a deeper dive into the cost of drugs and to see why they may cost so much. So let's get some basic facts out of the way. So in general, the average drug takes about 17 years to get to market. There have been numerous studies done on what it takes to bring to market, going as low as $314 million and as high as $2.8 billion. The 314, I can't even find the source for it, but it's usually by the generic drug industry, sort of talking about the cost of drugs. The Tufts Institute puts out the $2.8 billion number. There was, in March 2020, a study done in JAMA, and they pegged the mean cost of bringing a drug to market at $985 million, while the median cost of bringing a drug to market at $1.3 billion. So what does all this mean? So it means that in over 17 years, it takes anywhere from $314 to $2.8 billion to bring a drug to market, which means that over the course of a year, that same drug every year, you're basically spending between 18 million to 164 million every year to potentially bring that drug to market, knowing fully well that it may never come to market. So it's the equivalent of going to a casino, playing roulette, and betting $164 million every year, hoping that your drug comes to market. Okay, what does that mean on a daily basis? It means that you spend anywhere from $50,000 every single day for 17 years, not knowing if a drug will come to market, all the way through to almost $500,000 to $451,000, hoping that a drug will come to market for 17 years. If you were walking into a casino and you were betting $451,000, or we can use a more conservative number, we can use either you could use maybe the $158,000 number, which is what the JAMA study might suggest, based on the 985 million. So anywhere from, let's assume that number just for argument's sake, right? $158,000 every single night for 17 years. How much would you expect the return would be? If you were paying roulette, you would get 35 times what your investment was, which means that if you put in $1 billion, which is what the JAMA study suggests the drug costs, you would make $35 billion. So that's the first question. Well, that's great, but you aren't gambling. What do other companies charge? Okay. Apple has a gross profit of 38%. Netflix is a lot less. It's at about 10%. Google has a net profit of 16%. Lilly and Pfizer are in the middle, between 20% and 28%. And I just picked up a couple of different random companies. My point being that the profit percentages are not as off as one might think. So it depends on what people compare to other countries, and it's a valid thing to compare to, let's be honest. But overall, when you compare it to other large multinational companies, Lilly and Pfizer's profit margins are not so completely different compared to
Apple's. For example, Apple is almost twice what Pfizer makes in terms of profit margin. But we don't complain about Apple's margins. The other thing to consider when you're talking about bringing the cost of bringing a drug to market, everyone talks about bringing it to market. What about the cost of keeping it on the market? So you may have post-approval studies. You may have Sunshine Act reporting. You may have marketing costs, and we'll talk about marketing costs in a little bit. You have distribution costs. You have delivery costs. You have the corporate costs, Sunshine Act costs. These all add up. So even after you've spent over $2.8 billion or over $1.3 billion or over $985 million, you still have continuing costs of doing business. So if that's true, what should that cost include? Now, imagine that instead of trying to treat diabetes, where you have, I think it's like 300 million people across the world, you're now treating a rare disease state drug. The cost of bringing that drug to market hasn't substantially changed. You still have to do a bunch of different studies. But if you have a much smaller patient population, you have to by default charge them more to get that same drug to market. So that's where those costs start coming from. So let's address the question of marketing, right? If you've spent $2.8 billion to bring a drug to market, $1.3 billion to bring a drug to market, is it really fair to say that now you need to hope that someone knows that your drug is there? I've worked as a pharmacist for over 20 years, and if someone didn't tell me that a drug was there, I probably wouldn't know about it because I'm busy doing my job. So someone needs to, and that's not just me, that's most people. You need people to tell you what's coming out of the market, why is it better, what does that compare to my patient population? And hopefully you hear enough voices to go, okay, this person's saying this person's saying this. What does this mean for my patient? In the end, you're going to make the best decision for your patients. And there's a cacophony of voices, but hopefully you learn something from each of them to go, you know what I have, the 25-cent hydrochlorothiazide is the best drug for this, or do I need something new? And why do I need that something new? Is there a better safety profile that's better for this type of patient? Those questions, working in ignorance does not help my patients. So from that perspective, it makes sense. Now, is there room to bring the cost of drugs down? Absolutely. There are some ways we probably need to de-risk the situation, which will bring the risk. It shouldn't take 17 years to bring the drug to market. How do we bring that down? It shouldn't be the equivalent of $500,000 per day to bring a drug to market. How do you bring those costs down? So if you think I misunderstood something, if you think there's a better way to bring the drugs to market, leave a comment. If not, hit the like button.
This is the Darshan Talks podcast, regulatory guy, irregular podcast with host Darshan Kulkarni. You can find the show on Twitter at Darshan Talks or the show's website at darshantalks.com.